Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today we're looking at another team-up deck. This time it's going to be based all around Aerodactyl. And Aerodactyl can hit some pretty nice numbers. He hits 90 plus 90 more if there are no EXs or GXs on your side of the field. So we are going to be a completely non-GX deck, and that's how we're going to swing for some big damage every single turn with this guy. He is of course a Fossil. That's always been horrible in the Pokemon trading card game. It's very hard for fossils to ever see play because they're not physical basic Pokemon, they're trainer cards, and it's oftentimes way harder for us to find these trainers than it is to find physical Pokemon. But at the very least, we do have Jirachi in this format to help scout the top 5 cards of our deck and try and find some of these item cards. So that's one big thumbs up for Aerodactyl to really help us get these into play. We also have Giratina in here as like a backup attacker. And what's great about it is we only need to dedicate one deck space to Giratina, and he's essentially infinite thanks to his Distortion Door ability. So in non-GX matchups where it would otherwise be a huge headache to keep getting these fossils into play and getting your Aerodactyls into play, which is an annoying stage 1, we can focus more heavily on the Giratina and simply keep using Distortion Door to bring him back every time. So we have the big one-hit KO Merchant in Aerodactyl for the GX matchups, and we're going to try and spam Giratina in non-GXs. So that's pretty much the idea. And we have Malamar as the acceleration. Obviously, Aerodactyl's attack is for 3 colorless energies, so we're going to be playing DCEs in here, but we also have the Psychic Energy that is also going to work nicely on the Giratina. That's the idea. So onto the Pokemon. We are playing 3 copies of that new Jirachi. As I said, it's going to help pull out these unidentified fossils, which is going to be all important because Aerodactyl, in a lot of matchups at the very least, will be our main attacker. It's also going to help us, get more ball search to find the Malamar pieces. These are also things that we need to try and get into play as early as possible as well for that energy acceleration. Then we do have that 3-3 line of Mali. I think we do have to make some compromises in this deck because we need to have space for these Aerodactyls, so just going to a 3-3 count I think is fine. Normally you only need to have 1 or 2 Psychic Recharges in play at any one time because you can rely on DCs as well to help you get into your Aerodactyls. We're going to have 1 copy of that Giratina, of course, so huge for just recycling itself in non-GX matchups. But it doesn't stop there. Yes, this card is absolutely bonkers. Distortion Door can also do some good math fixing for us, can put Aerodactyl into range of 190 hit point Pokemon, or in combination of things like Shrine, we can put even some stage 2 Pokemon in range with the racking up of Shrine and Distortion Door and Choice Band. We can hit some ridiculous numbers with this deck, so the Giratina can really help do some great math fixing at times as well. We have the Ditto Prism Star. I like it as a 4th Inkay and also opens the door to have the Pidgeotto that you can see 1 count of as well in the deck. It allows us to look at the top 2 cards of our deck every turn, put 1 straight into our hand, the other to the bottom of the deck, giving us some extra draw power throughout the game. It means we're slightly less vulnerable to a muck coming down because we are quite reliant on Jirachi. So this helps us out a little bit to try and draw us some extra cards throughout the game. I prefer this to playing something like Zeb Striker because we don't really want to discard things like DCEs if we have to dig. We don't really want to discard things like Aerodactyl or Unidentified Fossils either. I like having this extra search ability, but without the sort of downside. So I think that's why we're going for the Pidgeotto. Onto the item cards and the stadiums, we're going to have 1 copy of Rescue Stretcher. It's a little on the cheeky side, but when you always have that Giratina to fall back on, I think it's going to be okay. 1 Fossil Excavation Map. It allows you to either find a unidentified fossil from your deck or from your discard pile, so it's either recycle or just being an extra way to find a fossil in the early turns. I like this just for the prize factor. If we do prize an unidentified fossil, it's even more difficult to get into play, so having this 1 extra copy in the deck can recycle an unidentified fossil if one's been knocked out, or we can just go ahead and grab one for us, which is great. Just makes that Jirachi more likely to hit. Then 2 copies of Treasure. It's going to work on all of our Mali pieces. 2 copies of Nest Ball. Again, good for getting the Malis into play early, as well as those Jirachis. 4 copies of Ultra. That's going to be the most versatile, getting everything that we need. 3 Choice Band for this increased damage output with the Aerodactyl, which is awesome. 3 copies of a Skateboard to support the Jirachi engine, and it means that we can use the Malamar more effectively while Jirachi is sat in the active. And 2 copies of Shrine, just for some good math fixing. It means we can hit 190 really easily against some important GXs like Ultra Necrozma. can push us a lot more in terms of like trying to get over Zoroark and stuff like that. So we have the Choice Band and we have Shrine, so we have lots of outs to push beyond 180. It's going to be really nice, especially against like stage 2 decks. We can even put those in range. Really disgusting, to be honest. This deck kind of feels like Gramble-esque, where you have this Shrine just to sort of supplement you here and there. It's basically Gramble plus 20 damage, which is kind of a scary concept to think about, but it's awkward in its own right. Like, Gramble is much easier to operate turn by turn. Onto supporters, we're going to play 2 copies of Lillie. It's a good turn 1 draw supporter for us, which is nice, and it's going to get our hand size up. 3 copies of Erika's Hospitality. I think we have enough discarding cards and insta-playable cards in our deck that this is pretty much always going to be live, and I'm hoping that it will draw more cards than Lillie in the majority of turns. 3 copies of Guzma, so that we can pick off GX Pokemon and also pivot into our Jirachi if we need to dig a little bit harder on a certain turn, or just move something out of the way. And we're going to play 4 copies of Cynthia as well for some extra draw support. Onto the energy, 10 is going to be what we go for. I think 4 DC and 6 Psychic is fine. Obviously, we only need really like 1 or 2 Malamar hits in most turns to be completely safe with our Aerodactyls. We still need to have a reasonably high amount just so that we can try and see them early. And if we are trying to use Giratina in non-GX decks, we still want to have plenty that we can access. It is a little bit on the cheeky side. I think I could see an extra energy be popped into this deck, but for now, I'm just sticking with the 10 count. So there is the full list. Pause now if you want to see it and start making some notes and jotting it down and all that good stuff. But we'll move on to the tech options. Bill's Analysis is a supporter that I've not weaved into any one of my decks just yet. I always think of it as sort of like a consideration, but it never makes the final 60. And even in this deck where we're playing Fossils, I think it didn't quite make the cut. I think Erika's Hospitality is usually just better. I think the Bills is better on turn 1 exactly, but I think that's just about it. You can try experimenting with Bills if you have trouble getting your Fossils into play, though. That's the biggest concern that I could foresee. Adventure Bag is another one of these item cards. When we're playing Escape Boards and Choice Bands, it just makes sense that if Jirachi can pluck this out, you get such great value from it. But I think it doesn't outweigh any other card currently in the deck, and I think space is a little tight. Maybe I would play the 4th Escape Board before the Adventure Bag anyway, just because of like random field blows and stuff like that could be annoying, but I would like to make room for an Adventure Bag, to be honest. And then there's the additional sort of draw cards that we could be playing in the deck. At the moment, I'm just having the Pidgeotto and Jirachi. We're obviously playing Treasures, so there's always the option to let loose on people. I think this deck is a little clunky in the early turns. You don't want to use Let Loose early, but it could still be an option for you late in the game. Magcargo, you might prefer to Pidgeotto. We do have 2 Lillie and 3 Erika. Maybe you reduce the Cynthia count a little bit more to have more Lilies in the deck, and that will, you know, incorporate a Magcargo in much better. And it again helps you pick out things like DCE, which are quite crucial in the deck. So maybe this outweighs the Pidgeotto in your opinion. Or we could just have another basic Oranguru to help us draw a few more cards throughout the game. I think overall the Magcargo is the one that I would most likely experiment with. If you're feeling like the Pidgeotto is not pulling its weight, we could try putting in good old Smooth Over to see if that helps. Onto the matchup overview, I think it's actually pretty solid for this deck. I think the consistency is the biggest headache. On paper, its math is incredible, and it can just churn out big numbers for a non-GX build. So there shouldn't be too many things that should be that scary. I think Zoro Tails would be one of those decks that can quite easily just prey on the free Jirachis that they can be knocking out, whilst also knocking out the active quite freely, which is a bit of a pain. Obviously, your Aerodactyl doesn't find it too difficult to knock out Zoroarks, but if they're doing like a Malamar knockout whilst also setting up a Jirachi, it might get difficult for you. Mali variants, I think you're just an inconsistent Mali build compared to something like a Psychic Mali, which has, you know, the Giratina as well that they can be using probably earlier because they have more Malamars, and also something like Ultra Necrozma always has its Sky Scorching Light play where they can Distortion Door on a Jirachi or maybe a couple times on your Malamars, and then they can Sky Scorching Light to finish you off, which is a big problem. I think Lost March is probably difficult. This deck also is one that doesn't really want to get hit with Let Loose early, and Lost March will always be doing that. I think Lost March is a really efficient deck at trading in non-GX wars, to be honest, just because of its consistency. I think Simeon Coco is a big issue. The Aerodactyl is weak to lightning, and if Coco is already putting in Electro Powers to improve the Zapdos matchup, it's going to be you know, caught in the crossfire and very effective against Aerodactyl as well, which is a huge problem. And the deck needs to commit many spaces to its board because it needs to have Malamar to make sure that we can continue to attack. And White Kyurem, I think, is also going to be awkward. Not only can they try and race us, but they also often play Cyrus Prism Star, and that can reset our board in quite an awkward way. And I think Zapdos Jirachi is just, you know, the most efficient non-GX racing deck. We do have Lightning weakness, so if they're playing other attackers outside of the Zapdos, they can be hitting you for weakness, so that's going to be a problem. And yeah, just the Zapdos early on in the game, knocking out your Jirachis, knocking out your Inkays, ruining your setup is going to be, you know, quite often just a lost condition for you. And that's kind of the biggest problem for this deck that I foresee. On to the closing thoughts. I think this is just another one of these decks in a long line of non-GXs that we have right now that can get one-shots. We've got the Tool Drop deck. We've got Nidoqueen. We've got Gramble. We've got Aerodactyl. We've got Lost March. We've got so many non-GX decks that can ramp into huge numbers. And it's down to us to sort of decipher which is the least consistent and the most easy to win with the least sort of flaws in it. And I don't think this is the one with the least, but I think it's close. I think the fossilness, or not the fossilness, the fossil awkwardness is still a problem, and it's still awkward that we rely on Malamar, which is a bit of an issue. And I think, as I said just a moment ago, Zapdos is the biggest reason this won't be a top tier contender. I think this is more likely just, you know, a non-GX deck that, again, loves seeing GX things. And honestly, its damage output is really nice. It's like a easier to play Gramble deck, I would say, with better damage output, but it trades off the sort of difficulty for less consistency, and I think that's definitely an issue for the deck. So I don't see this being a top tier contender. I think maybe it's a middle tier 2, high tier 3 style deck, just because it is non-GX that hits silly numbers. But I think the fossil mechanic is the biggest thing holding it back, as well as the fact that it probably doesn't have much of a game against Zapdos, which I imagine is always going to be the sort of entry level for any deck in this new format, because it's going to be a big barrier for entry, it's going to be popular, and it's going to be really strong. So that's all I have for you today, guys, on Aerodactyl. Let me know what deck you want to see next, because we are sort of scraping the barrel for the brand new team-ups things. I think I'm going to be able to get a few more out this week of brand new decks. And possibly towards the end of this week, I'll be looking at some updated lists for decks that we're already accustomed to. Some of those other things on the list just being updated already. So should be fun. Let me know what you guys think. And I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.